diary how historic that moment would be. So it seemed quite obvious that we would need to postpone the event on that date. And I'm very glad to see you all here tonight. Abir has set me a ambitious agenda of discussing the last decade or so of diaspora-Israel relations, and I interpreted this a bit broadly to make it I guess we'll call it a baker's dozen of a decade, starting in 2008 with the beginning of the Obama presidency until today. Now, I can tell you exactly where I was when President Barack Obama was elected to office. I had broken my foot in the summer of 2008, and I was supposed to be departing for Israel that June for my dissertation research, which later became my book, City on a Hilltop, American Jews in the Israeli Settler Movement. But because I was hobbling around Chicago and later my parents' house, I had to delay my trip to the last week of October. And I showed up essentially in Israel right in time for Election Day. And like all Anglos, I headed over to Mike's Place, which is a kind of bar, bistro, popular with English-speaking immigrants in Israel, to watch the election returns coming in. And it was very interesting to see what the opinions were there, and then to go upstairs in this venue in Jerusalem, for those of you who may know this area, where there's a very quaint cafe frequented by Israelis called Tmol Shushom, which is kind of it's a kind of throwback to an old Israeli kind of nostalgia. The name of the cafe itself sort of means once upon a time. It's a kind of cafe that, you know, Israeli hipsters and older philosophy professors and kind of native Israelis tend to hang out at. And the contrast between these two locations, one downstairs and one upstairs, when it came to the election of Barack Obama was quite poignant. Around the corner, I also saw posters of labeled sort of Barack Hussein Obama with an image of Barack Obama in a keffiyeh, which indicated that Israelis and Americans, or particularly American immigrants in Israel, had some very, very different attitudes when it came to the election of Obama. Something like 37% of Israelis were hopeful that Obama would win that night over John McCain, whereas 78% of Jewish Americans voted for Barack Obama in the 2008 election. So there's a very significant difference between Israeli attitudes and American Jewish attitudes towards the Obama administration from the very beginning. As you may recall, in a trip down memory lane, the Obama administration began with very much promise regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. He gave a speech in Cairo back in 2008, where he laid out some of his objectives for the broader Middle East and included the Israel-Palestine conflict, where he said very clearly that the Obama administration would support a two-state solution, but could not, force the parties themselves to do anything beyond what their own limits and constraints might be. That the United States would serve as a mediator, but it couldn't serve as an instigator for Israel-Palestinian peace. Now, I arrived in Israel just in time for the Obama administration to begin to put some serious pressure on the Israeli government, again, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has now been in office for over 11 years. He had come to power in 2007, shortly before Barack Obama himself had come into office. And the Obama administration, in an effort to try to establish confidence-building measures between Israelis and Palestinians and kind of reset the Israel-Palestine agenda from the Bush administration, which also had made its own overtures and attempts to urge the two parties to come together unsuccessfully, urged the Israeli government to implement a settlement freeze in 2009. 2010. This was right around the time that I was spending a great deal of my own time, professional time, wandering around the West Bank, interviewing settlers and doing other sorts of research for my book, which is about the American Jews in the Israeli settler movement. So I had an opportunity to see a lot of this in action, and I can tell you myself that I don't know what settlement freeze actually took place because they were building everywhere. And I really didn't get a sense that this was being implemented on the ground in a particularly extensive way. Yet promises were made that this kind of effort would entice Israelis and Palestinians to come back to the table, and that the Obama administration was trying to throw out some carrots and sticks to both parties in order to incentivize their return to a two-state solution. As you may recall, the settlement freeze mostly blew up when now President Biden came to visit Israel. And on the morning of his visit, as his plane was touching down at Ben-Gurion Airport, the Israeli administration announced a new set of prospective settlement building, Biden and requiring a series of very sensitive phone calls between Washington and Jerusalem during this visit. And for the most part, after that, things went somewhat awry. For the next several years, John Kerry, who was then the Secretary of State, was engaging in a very intensive kind of shuttle diplomacy, flying back and forth from Washington to Jerusalem and Ramallah in order to entice the parties to return to the table. This was after the first appointed envoy, George Mitchell, who famously had taken a very important role in the Northern Ireland Accords, quit his job because he couldn't manage to achieve his aims. And the much heralded return to the two-state solution and the hope that the parties might come together for some kind of final status agreement seemed to break down. Yet while much was made about the personal bad blood between Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama that seemed to boil over at times, in fact, Israeli-American relations during this period were quite friendly, and some of the strongest ties that these partners have ever experienced in the history of the US-Israel relationship. Barack Obama's administration was a strong supporter of Iron Dome. You may recall that there were 2 wars with Hamas in Gaza during the period of his presidency, in which he expressed both rhetorical and military support for Israel to defend her interests and her territory. And the Obama administration concluded a deal for over $38 million in foreign aid to Israel, which was the highest amount of aid that Israel had ever received. Yet at the same time, some of the personal relationships and professional dramas seemed to overtake the pragmatic approach that, in fact, both partners were exercising. When the United States announced its intentions to join the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran deal, Benjamin Netanyahu campaigned vigorously against it. You might recall that he showed up with all kinds of props in the United Nations with, ticking time bombs, and made a very famously vigorous reproach of the Biden administration, as well as the Iran deal itself, in the congressional changer in March 2015. I know that, in COVID times, it's hard to remember the drama of these activities, given so much that has happened subsequently. But that was quite a dust up in diaspora-Israel relations at the time. Shortly thereafter, the Arab Spring also broke out across the Middle East, quickly becoming something of an Arab winter, which distracted from the Israel-Palestine conflict. And much of the Obama administration's attention after failed shuttle diplomacy for several years shifted, perhaps, with some great degree of, necessity to surrounding Arab countries, particularly the overthrow of the Mubarak regime in Egypt and other developments throughout the region. So not much progress in the end was made before Barack Obama left office, though he famously sent Israel a parting gift in requiring the United States ambassador to the UN to abstain from a vote, therefore not taking position in what had traditionally been a US veto in a resolution criticizing settlement building in December of 2016, a month before the Trump administration came into office. So all in all, US-Israel relations had some pragmatic successes, but no real progress made towards peace. For the most part, American Jews were quite favorable to the Obama administration, and it was even the Iran deal, which split the American public, still didn't fracture, I think, the constituency in the US in the same way that subsequent events have since 2016. Now, those, of course, you know, the trip down memory lane of the Obama administration may seem like a long time ago, but I think that we are all still processing the Trump moment in the United States, which, you know, certainly for Israel was a very exciting development. Over 80% of Israelis were enthusiastic about the Trump administration, would have voted for him had they had the opportunity to do so in an American election. And certainly for some, particularly hardline Israelis, were very thrilled that the Obama administration had come to an end and saw certain threats to existential threats to Israel, like the JCPOA, and more direct threats to Israel from its neighbors, particularly with, you know, the consolidation of power of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the very precarious situation in the Syrian civil war on Israel's border, and other countries in the region. The arrival of the Trump administration was was fantastic news for Israel. Perhaps not so much for American Jews. That traditionally, though we don't have actually very good data still about the 2016 elections, American Jews voted the way they have for the most part in the entire electoral history of the United States, which is about, you know, 80% for the Democratic ticket and 20% for the Republican ticket. We should mention actually that despite a lot of hype about certain constituencies, particularly the New York area, which I'm sure very, very familiar of, who have been, you know, quite sympathetic and politically active with the Trump campaign, the most recent vote also showed the same kind of split, maybe with a point or two error in one direction or the other, but actually there hasn't been a very dramatic shift in the American Jewish vote at all over the last, you know, certainly the last decade and probably over the last 50 years. But the Trump administration was good news for Israel because they seem to support many of the policy positions and agendas of the Netanyahu government, which included announcing the shift of the US Embassy to Jerusalem in December 2017, which precipitated the cutting of ties of the Palestinians, at least officially, with the Trump administration. Only in the last 2 weeks has the Biden administration reestablished some kind of diplomatic relations with the official, you know, the official shadow consulate in Washington, D.C. and with Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. Likewise, Trump extended recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and began a process of delivering their own peace plan, which began in Bahrain last December when they brought together many different business leaders to discuss economic development in the region, what someone called, you know, the Middle East being the, you know, new hot IPO, and then later subsequently developed into the issuance of the Trump peace plan, which was debated intensively for the last, you know, 6 months or more, particularly because of its map, which was quite a crude and, you know, I think very, you know, very difficult to interpret kind of childish map. But the understanding behind it was that Israel would be able to annex most, if not all, of the West Bank under this plan. It's really very uncertain even today what this plan would have allowed for, which was all preempted by the announcement of the Abraham Accords this summer, in which annexation was taken off the table in return for the opening of diplomatic relations with the UAE and then later Bahrain and subsequently several other countries that have normalized relations with Israel, but also a kind of arms for peace deal where the United States would sell these nations F-35 jets, which they are very interested in acquiring, particularly because in their perception, the threat of Iran in their own backyard, in exchange for peace with Israel. So that was, you know, probably the capstone of the Trump presidency. Whether or not we can say that, you know, the Trump administration was particularly responsible for this normalization of relations is another story entirely. Certainly, there were quiet and friendly diplomatic ties between Israel and these regimes going back decades or more. but the innovation of the last 6 months has to bring this out into the light, and to see more people-to-people relations than I think anybody expected. Something like 50,000 Israelis traveled to Dubai in the last 2 months before the next wave of COVID. And there have been some delegations who have arrived in Israel, and much, I guess, warmer personal relations than most analysts and policy pundits, including myself, really expected to see. At the same time, while Trump was perceived as being quite friendly to Israel, it's no doubt to many of you in our discussion tonight that his stance towards American Jewry was far more problematic. Not long into his term, the terrible attack took place at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the Trump administration's response to these events was considered to be quite divisive. Of course, that was followed by the events in Charlottesville and the famous, good people on both sides comment, which was not interpreted, I think, overwhelmingly sympathetically by liberal American Jewry. And of course, leading up into our current moment, and when the day our talk was scheduled to be held, I think it was probably chilling to almost all of us to be watching television and seeing rioters wearing Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts in the Capitol Rotunda. So many of Trump's friends, whether or not he acknowledged them publicly or otherwise, certainly were his supporters, and it's been I think it's created an incredible degree of tension for the American Jewish community. Not to mention the dramatic spike in anti-Semitism, which is up tenfold over the Obama period, most importantly in ultra-Orthodox communities in New York that are highly visible to the non-Jewish public. And coronavirus itself and many of the conspiracy theories around COVID and the elections and otherwise have also dramatically accelerated anti-Semitic activity, particularly on the East Coast, perhaps more so than where I am here in the Midwest. The Trump administration was also quite polarizing because it incentivized, the left to regroup and to become more vocal when it came to questions about Israel and anti-Semitism. I'm writing a book right now about Zionism and identity politics. It's trying to look at really the first iteration of kind of contemporary debates between the period of 1967 and 1975, but no doubt that my book was inspired by the questions that my students have when they come into my office and say things like, I'm a Jew of color, I'm gay, I'm pro-abortion, I'm pro-immigrant, I'm I'm anti-fascist, I'm looking to express many of my progressive politics, but I'm finding great difficulty because I also identify as a Zionist, and sometimes not only as a Zionist, but just as a Jew. So I think that the Trump administration has really created a degree of polarization that did not exist during the Obama years, though certainly Obama himself was a progressive, was quite friendly with other progressives, had deep ties to that movement, and most progressives were very sympathetic to the Obama administration. So it's been a very polarizing last 4 years. We don't know yet, of course, what the Biden administration will do when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations. But we do know that thus far, the Biden administration has signaled very strong interest in rejoining the JCPOA and has appointed Bob Malley, who was a prominent figure in the 1990s in the negotiations of the Oslo Accords, to be his new envoy. This choice has also created some contention in the American Jewish community, mostly in the Israeli community, which would like to see the U.S. continue to take a strong stance against Iran and is not particularly interested in diplomatic overtures towards the regime. But from what we can tell thus far, Israel is very much on the back burner of U.S. foreign policy making. You may be seeing the tweets online of Israel's equivalent of the State Department and otherwise, suggesting that tweeting the number at which you can call Benjamin Netanyahu because he has not yet received the official phone call from President Biden, amongst other world leaders. Certainly the concerns of COVID-19 domestically will overshadow any U.S. foreign policy, including that in the Middle East going forward. We do think, though, that given the choices that the U.S. administration has made in appointing new State Department and defense officials, that there'll be a continuity with Obama policies of a two-state solution, and generally to try and re-engage both in the region and across the world and re-enter most treaties and organizations that the Trump administration had left behind. The big outstanding question, I think, about the Biden administration is, will there be any kind of opening for them to make any strong effort at mediation, given the fact that Israel is about to have its fourth election in 2 years this March, and the Palestinians have signaled their intention to have an election later on this fall. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas just signed a kind of unity agreement to signal their interest in moving forward. So with so much instability in the region and such uncertainty about the nature of the governing coalitions in both sides, it's hard to see how the Biden administration would be able to re-engage until more is sorted in the region. There's also a tension, I think, emerging in the Biden administration itself between Biden's mainstream liberalism and also that of Kamala Harris, and others in the movement that fashion themselves as in the more progressive left wing of the Democratic Party, and how much influence some of their attitudes will have on the administration's policy towards Israel-Palestine and the broader Middle East. So I think that gives us kind of a overview of U.S.-Israel relations and some about American-Jewish relations over the past decade. But I do want to say a few words about diaspora-Israel relations, to recall that although Abir has said that 4 out of 5 Jews today live in either the United States or Israel, other diasporas too fancy themselves as important partners in the Zionist enterprise and are largely interested and have skin in the game in the Jewish world, although often with very different conditions than we do. For example, those in Europe who are really experiencing an onslaught of violent anti-Semitism are very concerned about their own safety and continue to see Israel as a place of refuge from anti-Semitism, a kind of trope that is mostly, at least up until recently, been erased from the importance of the Zionist movement to American Jewry. Likewise, the tensions that are may become more apparent in the Biden administration between liberals and leftists are really only the sequel to events in the UK over the past 5 years, with allegations of institutionalized anti-Semitism in the UK Labour Party, as well as tensions more broadly between conservatives and leftists over the Middle East. We might say also a few words about more far-flung Jewish communities like South Africa and Australia and New Zealand, who also have vigorous ties to Israel, are very philanthropically supportive of the Israeli public, and tend to have more conservative policies when it comes to Zionism than some we might say on the whole in the UK or even in the United States. So we need to take into account that all of these countries with their Jewish populations are in different positions locally in terms of their own situational concerns, but also sometimes because of their situational concerns may have different politics or interests when it comes to their expression of diaspora-Israel relations than we do here in the United States. I think, though, the commonality that exists across all of these countries, and actually I would suggest that it would be in the interest of American Jewry to reinvigorate its ties with other diaspora countries, because I think we too are suddenly experiencing some of the problems that we thought were alien to America, particularly, you know, the sharp rise in violent anti-Semitism. And I think we could learn from the other diasporas' experiences, and also have more, I think, power and solidarity with other communities if we were going to take them, you know, take those relationships a bit more seriously than they have been in the past. But I think all of these diasporas are facing a certain challenge when confronting Israel, in that, you know, Israelis vote for Benjamin Netanyahu because they actually want Benjamin Netanyahu to be their prime minister. Most Israelis today would identify themselves as being center-right. They consider Benjamin Netanyahu to be more or less at the center of the spectrum. We here in the United States consider him to be on the right. So already we're talking in different terms. But Israelis have voted 3 times in a row for more or less the same government. There's been very little difference actually between election 1, 2, and 3. And I suspect that there'll be almost no difference with the 4th election this March. And that's because it represents the view of the average Israeli, which may look very different from the views of the average American Jew when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict and which policy choices they would prefer. I think there's also a growing gap between the policy priorities of the Israeli public and those of the American Jewish public when it comes to Israel. If you open the front page of haaretz.co.il, the Hebrew edition of Haaretz newspaper, which is a left-wing newspaper in Israel, but also considered to be, you know, sort of the New York Times of Israel, a very, I guess, prestigious publication. Or if you're looking at some of the other, you know, the other Israeli periodicals, the Yediot Achronot or Israel Hayom, or most of, you know, Israel's mainstream media, the concerns that you're going to see on the front page are Iran, COVID-19, security in the region, Hezbollah, the threat of you know, Hamas rockets or Hamas tunneling under the border with Israel, and also domestic issues, the educational system, crime, you know, the political instability of the last several election cycles. Now, if I opened haaretz.com, the English language edition of Haaretz, I would see a multiplicity of articles about, or at least in the pre-COVID era, about what's happening with the egalitarian prayer space at the Kotel. Why is it that reform and conservative denominations are not being given full consideration when it comes to conversion in Israel? Questions about the Israel-Palestine conflict and diaspora-Israel relations. How is Israel affecting the experience of anti-Semitism in the United States? Frankly, we're having 2 very different conversations with 2 very different sets of interests, and there really isn't a shared vocabulary or vision for the future. Israelis and American Jews, and diaspora Jews more generally, on quite parallel tracks. And it's very hard to see, especially in a post-COVID era where we've actually been separated in ways that we've never been before. We haven't been able to travel between our 2 communities. Young people have not had the opportunity to engage in experiential education. We feel quite concerned with our own national agendas that diverge quite seriously. We can even see this in vaccination, that, you know, a great deal of the Israeli public have already been vaccinated, and most of us probably here in this room tonight don't know when that's going to happen for us, when our lives will go back to normal. We're just having very different conversations, and the question, I think, today, and the real challenge of diaspora-Israel relations, is not what's happening with the various administrations that probably, at least for the foreseeable future, will continue down a path of kind of pragmatic support for the state of Israel, whether or not they are able to bring Israelis or Palestinians back to the table. But the kind of growing gap between American Jews and Israelis that seems harder to bridge at the moment. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope that gave us a kind of brief overview of the last, you know, Baker dozen decade or so of diaspora-Israel relations, and maybe we can open this up for a discussion.
If you have please any question, just unmute yourself and ask the question. I think that's nicer. It's a very impersonal kind of platform and time that we're living in, and it's nice. The personal touch is can be nice. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Don't be shy.
Can I ask you something?
Okay.
I know this is your special expertise. What do you see as the future of all the settlements in the West Bank? It's a very troubling issue. You know, when I talk about this with my kids who are in their 30s, that's the first thing they bring up as a sticking point for them. And it's very troubling to me that they're so critical on that point. I don't know what to answer.
You know, if you're looking on social media today, if you're a denizen of Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of these other platforms, I think most of the time you see Israel or Zionism equals hashtag occupation, hashtag settler colonialism, hashtag apartheid, hashtag evil empire. So there's certainly I think a concern for younger people that my students were born today after 9/11. They have no recollection of the decade of the 1990s when Israelis and Palestinians were intensively engaged in a peace process, which was sort of my formative decade, my experience that brought me personally and professionally to this path was really the question of where were you when Yitzhak Rabin was shot, which was very much probably the question of a previous day. Where were you when John F. Kennedy was shot? And my students have no recollection of this. Their memories, are certainly quite dim for the beginning of the 2000s. But if they remember anything at all, it's the Second Intifada, the cycle of violence between Israel and Hamas, absolutely no progress in peacemaking, and I think growing international opprobrium and isolation when it comes to Israel, and the framing of the left today, which sort of is a house built on the planks of colonialism, of resisting colonialism, the patriarchy, and state violence. Has been grafted onto Israel or the Israel-Palestine conflict, whether or not that's a precise fit for the particular case. I think that Zionism, to my mind, and I identify today as a liberal Zionist, and that's not, I think, a very popular position to take. Certainly not in academia, I can tell you that much. But Zionism is many of these things, but it is also other things. It is also the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It is a safe refuge from anti-Semitism. And most of all, it's an expression of Jewish self-determination. I think that there are elements of the Jewish tradition that suggest that nationhood, or the idea of a nation, is one aspect of the way Judaism, modern Judaism, is expressed. As much as it is a faith and a people, I think it's also a nation, or at least there should be, I think, international consensus that the rights, nationhood rights, is a conversation for the Jewish community to have, and not for others outside of the Jewish community necessarily say the state of Israel doesn't have the right to exist, or Jews who wanted to take part in the progressive movement have to check their Zionism or the national aspect of their Judaism at the door in order to engage in progressive politics. And that, I think, is something concerning, not something new. Certainly this was true in the decade of the 1960s and 1970s as well, but I think we're seeing a real resurgence of many of those debates, which gets us to the Israeli settler movement, which was the initial part of your question, that I think young people today, and certainly my students, take my course because they want to know about the occupation, and they want to know about what happened after 1967. And the truth is that today there are 450,000 Jewish Israelis who live in the occupied territories. And I mean by that the West Bank not areas of the Green Line that are formally annexed to the municipality of Jerusalem, in which case we'd be talking about 550,000 or 600,000 Jewish Israelis that are living in all kinds of, very large suburban neighborhoods of Jerusalem, like Gilo or Ramot, otherwise. So this is a very large number of people. And the two-state solution has always suggested that some parts of the Israeli settler movement, that which is generally considered within the Israeli consensus, will remain part of territorial Israel, and that there will be land swaps to allow a Palestinian state to emerge on something like 92% of the West Bank. But these large settler communities are not going anywhere. I think we also have to talk about the changing demographics of the Israeli settler movement today. If you're watching TV, your image of the Israeli settler is a guy with a knitted kippah, maybe with payas, wearing hippie clothing, carrying a automatic rifle on some windswept hilltop of the West Bank, or marauding in a Palestinian olive grove, or walking through the streets of Hebron. The reality is today that a quarter of Israeli settlers are Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox, that live in two major cities near the Green Line. Another 40 or 50% of Israeli settlers are secular or traditional economic settlers who moved out of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem or other parts of Israel's coastal plain in order to find cheaper housing. You weren't going to be able to afford a 4-bedroom house with a garden in Tel Aviv, but you might be able to afford it in the West Bank. These are not necessarily hugely ideological settlers.
Palestinian lands.
They're not necessarily hugely ideological settlers, but yes, they are engaged in a settler project that the Palestinians see not only as each one of these parcels where the settlements sit as being Palestinian land, but the entire sort of existential concept of the West Bank itself is Palestinian territory. But I think that if we are going to continue with the rubric of a two-state solution, we're just kind of relitigating the past. When we think about this, there's no doubt that many of these settlements are going to remain in place. They will be absorbed into territorial Israel, and some kind of land swaps are going to happen. Now, what's happening, though, that's very disconcerting is that the window is increasingly closing in order to partition the land because of building not in areas that foreclose the opportunity to divide the land neatly and allow Palestinian communities to have some kind of territorial contiguity, even with the problem of the community in the West Bank and the community in the Gaza Strip, and how to connect the two of them, which is a very different and more difficult conversation. But the West Bank is becoming increasingly difficult to envision a solution that will allow kind of a clean separation between these two communities, even with limited evacuations of some settlements. So that's becoming a trickier and trickier problem. But I also think that public opinion and general generational attitudes have changed significantly. Both Israelis and Palestinians today on both sides would prefer a one-state solution. Now, a different one-state solution, one which Israel has sovereignty over all the territory between the river and the sea, which is essentially the situation that exists today, but in this case, it would be more de jure than de facto, or the opposite one-state solution, which Palestinians sometimes call a state for all of its citizens, in the sense of kind of democratic regime between the river and the sea, but one because of the Palestinian advantage when it comes to demography, would essentially call for the dismantlement of the Zionist enterprise through the ballot box. And they would like to see essentially a one-state solution in that direction. So we're each coming to a point where both Israelis and Palestinians it's not even about where you're going to draw the line in the sand anymore. It's going to be about whether you want to draw that line at all. So the concept of partition or a two-state solution, which has been the historic plan, since 1937 that I was teaching with my students last week for resolving, two national communities living in the same piece of territory, that the consensus around that policy of a two-state solution is increasingly eroding. And people are thinking in much more maximalist terms of, the one state that they would like to see. But I don't think that that's solely because of the settlement issue. That's one piece of the puzzle, one important piece of the puzzle, but I, as someone who studies the settler movement, I don't think that it's the sole obstacle to peace. It is only one of many very, very thorny problems that have not, seen a final status agreement reached and are, I think, causing, generational change on both sides to pursue alternative solutions. Sorry, that was a very long way of getting to your...
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your words previously, too.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question about the younger generation. My sense is that the younger generation does not feel close to Israel the way my generation did. That a lot of the Jewish philanthropists are not giving money to Jewish causes, they're giving money to other important American causes. So I see a great separation. I know my nephew lives in Israel, and when I talk about politics, he's very strongly pro-Trump. His mother happens to be an atheist, and she feels very distant from him because of his political attitudes. So I see I don't see a closing of the diaspora. I see separation. What do you think?
Well, certainly, my interest as a scholar really deals with the 1967 moment in American Jewish life and how that was absolutely a transformative time, politically, religiously, theologically, socially, and otherwise for American Jews and their relationship with Israel. If we recall, between 1948 and 1967, most American Jews were not particularly fervently Zionist. Certainly there was an appreciation for Israel, there was philanthropic giving to Israel, there was kind of armchair activism. Some limited number of American Jews, remember travel was much more difficult then, did visit Israel, but the kind of relationship that came to be after 1967 simply didn't exist during that period. And moreover, there was great hesitancy, I think, for the institutionalized American Jewry, the American Jewish Committee and otherwise to forge strong relationships with Israel. You can recall in the decade of the 1950s, the American Jewish Committee kind of bullied the Israeli government into what is known as the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein Agreement, which was essentially a kind of non-interference pact between Israel and American Jewry that said that, we support Israel, but we don't want you endangering our status of assimilation here as American Jews in the 1950s, of, Holocaust survivors or second generation American immigrants. And we're not really that crazy about the idea that, we may be accused of dual loyalty here. And I think in some ways we're actually returning a little bit to that moment that it's not so much that, American Jews are antagonistic towards Israel as much as they just see their future here in the United States. And they don't necessarily want Israel to prejudice their experience of assimilation into American society, into maybe their politics in the progressive movement or otherwise. And that, that's obviously a very big difference from, sort of the 1967 generation that was quite motivated, by the events of the 1967 war and its aftermath to stand in solidarity with Israel. And I think the story of the last 50 years, more than the last decade, is sort of how did that unanimity with Israel, when the sociologist Marshall Scolaire polls in the summer of 1967 that 99% of American Jews stood in solidarity with Israel, how did that winnow over time, how and why, and how did, where are we with the contemporary generation? I think there's also an issue that Israelis themselves, see themselves on a different path than American Jews. They like American Jews. They don't mind, seeing birthright kids come over, but I don't think they necessarily feel that their personal life experiences in any way, mirror that of their American Jewish colleagues. The average 18-year-old who might be going on a birthright trip is just out of high school, is probably going to go to university, is, very young and inexperienced. The average 18-year-old in Israel is right about to be drafted into the army, where they're going to spend the next, 2.5 or 3 years and possibly longer. They won't attend university until they're in their mid-20s. They might already be starting to get married and have children by that point. So, you know, they're just in very different places in their lives because of the expected trajectories of the average American Jew and the average Israeli Jew of the millennial generation. But I think the politics are also important. You know, American Jews overwhelmingly are liberal, or at least of current generations and generations since the 1950s. That is not necessarily true in Israel. They're moving increasingly to the right. The other thing that I would say is that there's also going to be a very profound demographic shift. In 2032, the Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population of Israel, could be something like 30% because they have extremely high birth rate. Today, the Haredi population is already 12%. You know, the face of Israeli Jewry is frankly going to look very different from the face of liberal American Jewry. And I think that the Netanyahu government, in fact, has taken that into account and sort of on some level has written off American Jewry because just doesn't see their priorities matching his own and those of his constituency and those of his governing coalition. So I think we're just in very different places, and you know, American Jews themselves, you know, intuit that there's just not that you know the signal isn't traveling in either direction. Neither is it that American Jews particularly feel themselves in affiliation with Israel, nor does Israel necessarily see itself in strong affiliation with liberal American Jewry. So I think we are in quite a divide, and I'm not really sure how that can be overcome. Although I do feel that I have students who are, you know, taking my classes because they're still strongly interested in the Israel-Palestine conflict and exploring their Jewish identities, and that's important to them in some way, and they're trying to figure out how to articulate that in a space that doesn't necessarily allow them to hold all their identities simultaneously, particularly if they're interested, you know, in politics on really either side of the spectrum today. Being Jewish is problematic in one way or the other, and that's part of the concern. The last thing I would say is I think that it's also that you know, Israel. We see this in many studies that your affiliation with Israel correlates not necessarily with your approval of the Netanyahu administration or your knowledge or interest about what's happening in Israel. It correlates most highly with Jewish identity. And I think the question is really, are today's students, you know, do they have the same kind of Jewish identity that those in the 1967 generation did? In 1967, most American Jews socialized with other Jews, were members of synagogues or other Jewish organizations, you know, took part in communal affairs. Most American Jews today didn't receive the same level of Jewish education, aren't members of synagogues, may not have a Jewish partner, aren't necessarily seeing their Jewish identity as being their primary identity. In fact, I think there's been something of a shift that instead of talking about themselves as Jewish Americans, they now talk about themselves as American Jews, that their American identities are much more significant than their Jewish identities. And that I think also affects attitudes with Israel, because really it's kind of a wag the dog kind of affiliation that, you know, your interest and inclination to engage with Zionism and with Israel is mostly led by your feelings of Jewish identity.
Quick question.
Thank you.
Quick question. How are you? First of all, I have a statement and a question. I have a lot of Israeli friends who are leaving Israel, secular Jews, architects, lawyers, teachers, who say the Israel that exists now is not the Israel they grew up in, and that the Haredi Jews are really basically driving them out because the government, mostly Bibi, is pandering to them. And it's sort of like the original mistake that Ben-Gurion made, thinking they don't have to go in the military, they can live separately, we'll subsidize them, has become like something that's growing and growing and growing and changing Israel in some ways, in a trend that's unrecognizable to the American Jew, which doesn't make it easier when the rabbis don't even accept some American Jews because of the way they might have been converted or parents married or whatever. That's a real concern for me. But that's not what my question. My question has to do, on the right, I feel totally alienated by the extreme Orthodox. But on the left, I'm really alienated by BDS. And what bothers me is Israel does a very poor job, as does the American media, in pushing back at BDS. They always say that their defining principle is Israel has to give up the occupied territories. And most Americans think that means the West Bank. But I've been reading more, and you'll correct me on this if I'm wrong, that their doctrine of what BDS is, occupied territories, is the entire state of Israel. And only when Israel is no longer Israel will BDS feel they're satisfied. So when American Jews back BDS, it drives me crazy because you have all these other terrible countries. They don't even try to oppose at all, but they're really against Israel. So that's really it's a long question, but that's my question. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll first start with your comment about the two Israels, which is to say, first of all, the two Israels of the religious and secular. I just published a piece in Haaretz today about Haredim and the violations of COVID-19 restrictions. It has really polarized the country because you have 12% of the population that frankly just isn't participating in public health at all. And not only because of the real difficulties of ultra-Orthodox families to, confront social distancing, to do all the things that we're supposed to be doing right now. If you're living in poverty, if you have a family of 10 in a small apartment, it's not going to be so easy for you to, and you don't have Netflix because you don't use the internet. What are you supposed to do to, be able to, comply with public health guidance for COVID-19? But there's also something much more trenchant going on, which is really about power, and that the Haredi leadership has come to understand that they are in a very strong position because Netanyahu is extremely dependent on Orthodox parties to form his coalition, and that moreover, if they want to continue to extract certain subsidies from the state and otherwise, that violating COVID and being kind of a part of the population that the Israeli government has acknowledged that it can't control has certain political benefits. So that's one version of the two Israels. It's causing a lot of secular and even people that we might identify as national religious Jews, religious Zionists for leaving Israel. The other question is the two Israels of the economy, which is we have startup nation and we have everyone else. It's great if you work in the high-tech sector in Israel. You make a big salary, you drive a nice car, you probably live in the suburbs. If you're everyone else, especially if you're in the overeducated middle class, you're in real trouble today. There's just simply no opportunity for you. And since COVID-19, another million Israelis out of 9 million have fallen into basically levels of poverty. So what the economic situation of Israel is going to be when they emerge from COVID-19 is just going to be absolute shambles. There's no doubt that the Israeli economy is serious trouble. And I would imagine that there will be a further exodus. There's also some two Israels that is ideological, the people who have just, had it with the obligations of being part of the Zionist enterprise, and they'd like to, not have to focus exclusively on their Jewish Zionist identities, and they'd like to go live in Berlin and, be someone else. So there's a little bit of that as well, but I think that, definitely there's good. I mean, it's a very, it's an accelerating trend. We don't actually have a lot of good scholarship about Israelis that live abroad, which is really unfortunate because there are, obviously very large communities here in the United States, but also, in the UK and Germany, throughout Europe, increasingly in Australia and other places. And Israelis, as their communities grow and they spend more and more time out of Israel, their identities change. They have certain kinds of solidarities that exist amongst themselves outside of Israel, and that would be interesting for scholars to study. I don't know why we're not doing more of that. To get to your second question, though, which I think was the real question about political alienation. I think that American Jews may find themselves increasingly politically homeless, neither feeling comfortable in a kind of Trumpian Republican Party, nor in a Democratic Party, and they may tilt increasingly leftwards over the next 4 years. So I really wonder where we're going to be in 2024 and whether Jews will just not feel that they have any really comfortable choices or that they need to make sacrifices that, are unsustainable for, the Jews, at least the Jews in the middle, which I think still most American Jews. When it comes to the BDS movement, look, the BDS movement is a really open tent. And that's part of the problem in trying to characterize what its ideology is. Certainly, it's a not very hierarchical movement, but its founder has made certain, I think, statements that suggest that he sees all of Israel as being occupied territory. That's not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but that's everything in the middle, that basically everything between the river and the sea has been occupied by the Zionist regime. And that would, that is an impediment to the goals of the boycott, sanctions, and divestment movement. On the other hand, there are people who are sort of principled two-state solution types who are looking for nonviolent opportunities to express their grievances through the BDS movement. But, you have a whole range of people. You have people who are actual, like, hardcore, real anti-Semites. People may not even be interested in the Israel-Palestine conflict whatsoever, but they gravitate towards this space because it's open to them, and it's a place where, they can maybe sometimes substitute Jew for Israeli or likewise and express their anti-Semitism. They're principled two-state people who are over on this end, and everybody in between. And I think that's what BDS is today. Although I'm increasingly troubled by what some of the statements that I've seen recently from founders of BDS that have, I think, really kind of crossed the line from anti-Zionism into statements that seem more anti-Semitic in the sense that they're holding Israel to double standards, and particularly just basically the Jewish people to double standards about whether Jews are allowed to have national rights when seemingly, national rights are available to many, if not most other groups, including the Palestinians themselves. So I think the BDS movement is kind of like a story to watch to see in what direction they go. I actually wonder where the BDS administration may moderate a little bit under the Biden administration, only because there's not such a reaction to the Trump policies in the Middle East. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I absolutely sympathize with the sentiment by young Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. They don't, many of them certainly don't want to affiliate with Hamas. They don't have many political options, and particularly nonviolent political options to express opposition to the occupation or to other policies. And they're looking for alternatives, but is BDS, kind of an open tent that is sort of, too open? I don't know. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Can I just
a question about Israeli politics?
We have two people talking over each other. I see Anita Altman.
It's Gil Kulik. Yes.
Anita, it's Joyce.
Okay.
Hi, it's a fairly brief question. We hear a lot these days about the anybody but Bibi movement in Israel. Big demonstrations in Balfour Street, an awful lot of discontent, and yet you seem to take it for granted that the next election won't produce any change, and Bibi will be back in public favor. And I'm wondering, where is the misconception there?
Let's put it this way. Before COVID, I was in Israel every 2 or 3 months, and you get into a taxi in central Tel Aviv, and of course your taxi driver, segues into politics within 2 minutes of the conversation and wants to tell you what he thinks about, about the next election cycle. And he'll say, I hate Bibi. Bibi's corrupt. Bibi's craven. Bibi, pursues policies that I don't agree with, but there's nobody but Bibi. And I think that explains a lot about the attitude of the average Israeli, that they see Netanyahu as being able to guarantee their security. Bombs aren't blowing up on buses anymore. Cafes aren't, being blown to bits by suicide bombers. The escalation between Hamas and Israel has been on a relatively low boil over the last 2 or 3 years or so. So they're going to vote for Bibi. They hate a lot of things about him. And, every single one of my friends is out there in the street protesting what they're calling the prime minister of Israel every Saturday night. But most Israelis are still going to vote for Bibi. Also, they're looking around and looking at their other alternatives. What else exists? The left in Israel, although, has consolidated a little bit in this most recent election cycle, has really done very poorly. The Labor Party, the founding party of the state of Israel, the first Knesset for the first 30 years was in the majority of the state, almost didn't make it over the electoral threshold last election. So the left is in decline. The center has a lot of sparring egos, many of whom are kind of disgruntled Likudniks who left the Likud at one point in time or the other because of the corruption of Netanyahu and Netanyahu's kind of, dictatorial leadership style. But they're all squabbling amongst themselves, and Netanyahu will just sit back and wait for them to, stick the knife in the back of one another, and then he'll come out with 30 or 35 mandates in the next election, as he has in the last three election cycles, and I think the fourth, as they all squabble amongst themselves and have diminishing returns for their own parties. So then Netanyahu is left with the same kind of coalitions that he has before. He has to cobble together this sort of right-wing religious bloc of ultra-Orthodox parties, of security hawks, maybe even of, out and out, xenophobes and, former and current Kahanists. And that's essentially, I think, how this election was going to pan out. It's not that I don't want to see the great white hope of Israel, of the left, reuniting, or the center gaining ground, but I think that unfortunately, there's absolutely no ideological coherence amongst the nobody but Bibi camp, which means that they can't ever manage to cobble together the coalition. And also, they're not very strategic about it either. Netanyahu goes into each election cycle thinking ahead towards the 23rd of March, when he's going to have to put together a coalition. He's making all kinds of deals even before Israelis have voted in order to ensure that reality. The center and the left just isn't doing that. They're running on their own platforms. They're squabbling amongst themselves. They're knifing each other in the back. So what's going to happen on March 23rd? How are they going to put together a coalition? They're going to be at the same sort of standstill or sort of, stillbirth that they were in the last three election cycles. And I'm sorry to be so depressing about it, but I think I believe it. So that, I think, stay tuned. I would love to be surprised. Let's put it that way. I would love to be surprised.
A couple of comments. I think that to worry about the extent of the influence of BDS in the Democratic, you should know that I'm very involved in democratic politics at the national level as well as at the local level. And the role of BDS is very small in the Democratic Party. There is a larger progressive faction in the Democratic Party, but it's more focused on social issues and economic issues in the United States. I think the leadership of the Democratic Party in general, unlike the Republican Party, is much more aware of the need to trend towards the middle in order to win elections, especially in terms of keeping the majority in the House and the majority in the Senate, as well as winning presidential elections. So I don't think that that's a danger, and I don't think that Jews are going to find less of a home in the Democratic Party. Second thought is about the 1967 generation, which I was part of, and I was living in Israel in 1967, 68, and went as a volunteer right after the Six-Day War, but I had been very involved in the Zionist movement even before that. And I think one of the factors in my generation was that we were still very close to our European grandparents, their fears, the reason they had come here, and also to the Holocaust. We're much further away from that today. It's ancient history to my son. And although he has a very strong Jewish identity, he's not really interested in Israel. It has very little to do with his life. He's an American Jew, as you said. And I think part of that is just a natural generational change. His life experiences are very different than mine were. If I speak Yiddish to him, he jokingly says to me, "Stop talking that foreign language." I think that part of that, though, is also the natural need of the younger generation to separate itself and differentiate itself from the older generation, and that's one of the ways they do it. It amazes me that having gone to yeshiva, how he still is very, very American and identifies as American and fits in just as well with his American non-Jewish Ivy League colleagues, as well as he fits into the Jewish community. And he sort of goes between both the Jewish and non-Jewish community with equal ease. it's just a very different place. I mean, I was still part of the, a descendant and close to the immigrant Jewish experience. He's not. And I think that plays a very strong role today in where the younger generation of American Jews is at.
I absolutely agree. I mean, maybe I'll start with your first comment about BDS and the Democratic Party. I mean, it's true that I live on, planet academia, which is in a galaxy far, far away from, the rest of, kind of the rest of the political spectrum, including, organized, institutionalized political parties. I am curious about what's going to happen when my students, increasingly are taking roles at the, first in citywide elections, particularly in New York, we see a really strong constituency of Democratic Socialists in the New York City Council, and likewise we're seeing that here in the alderman races in Chicago, and likewise. And then maybe, in another 10 years when they're moving into national politics. And then I don't really know what's going to happen, but I hope it'll give us all some comfort that, at least in 2024, we probably won't be confronting those questions. I certainly relate to what you have been saying about, kind of the differences between the 1967 generation, which was much closer, I guess, to the old world than the new world, than those millennial students I teach today. Students that I teach who were born in 2002, probably many of them have never actually met a Holocaust survivor because, so many have passed away at this point. And although, the Holocaust and Israel are sort of the twin idols of American Judaism today, the Holocaust feels very distant from them. It's something you watched on TV in Schindler's List. It wasn't something that your parents or even your grandparents may have talked about. And in a way, I guess American Jews are sort of victims of their own success of assimilation. They actually can go back and forth between being Americans and Jews like your son. I don't think that's quite as true in other diasporas. I lived in the UK for 5 years. Jewish culture is not part of popular culture in the United Kingdom in the same way that, people are watching Seinfeld and eating bagels here in the United States. And even your Muslim friends know a little bit of Yiddish. It's just simply not the case in many of these other diaspora communities that are much more cloistered and isolated from the larger public than we are here in the United States. And that obviously inflects their attitudes towards Israel because they don't have the same opportunities to be go-betweens. And I think that, if we've obviously, group solidarity is always increased by an external threat. So American Jews have been quite privileged that for the most part, recent generations have not experienced violent anti-Semitism. If that increases here, I think we may look more and more like other diaspora communities, but those other in those other countries, they just haven't had the ability to assimilate in the way that American Jews have, and that just changes their whole outlook.
I think
I would love to have the opportunity to speak with you at greater length about the Democratic Party, though.
I would enjoy that also.
Could I speak?
I'm so sorry. I just want to be conscious to everybody's time, so I'll just say a quick. We'll try to wrap this, even though it's really interesting discussion, and I'm sorry to interrupt it. I do want to say thank you so much, Dr. Hirschhorn, for being with us today, sharing your wisdom about the different communities, about the overview, and also the answers that you gave to the interesting questions. I would say that our next session in this series would be exactly a month from now, in March 11th. We're going to have Peter Beinart as our speaker guest, which I think is going to be very interesting and lively discussion also after that. So I invite you all to join us also then. Thank you so much. Thank you all for participating, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you for being here, and I hope you'll tune in to the rest of the speakers in the series. I heard you've had some great guests who came before, and certainly Peter Beinart and others who may come after will be really dynamic people to listen to who are having really big impact on our contemporary discourse. particularly for those of you who have millennial children or grandchildren. I'm pretty sure that they're all, that Peter Beinart is a very significant figure for them in their intellectual development. So I hope you'll return for that conversation. But thank you for having me with you, and stay warm and well, and hope you'll get vaccinated very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
How can we reach you?
Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.
Thank you.
How can you be reached?
You can follow me on Twitter at Sara Hirschhorn1, or you can drop me an email at my Northwestern email address. If you Google me, my email address should come up. It's sarah.hirschhorn@northwestern.edu.
Right, I know. I teach at Columbia.
Okay. Hopefully, I'm not too hard to find.
Thank you very much.
It's fine. I don't go anywhere. That also makes things a lot easier during COVID. I barely leave my house. So, all my days of, I used to do a lot of traveling, but, I've never been home so much in the last decade of my life. So